I hate wearing name tags, but sometimes they're a necessity when we first meet people. This episode is like wearing a name tag, plus standing up in a room full of people and introducing myself. Welcome to the show. As I kick off Funeral Potatoes and Wool Mittens, I am releasing the most uncomfortable episode I'll ever record. The one on which I talk only about myself. Because I'm hoping this podcast creates a heartwarming community of people who share their stories alongside with me, and the show becomes binge-worthy to more people than my sisters and a few friends, I think it's worthwhile to introduce myself. Hello, my name is Staci Mergenthal. On today's episode, we're talking about why I started this podcast and where the name came from, what you can expect, and a personal look into my history of baking. My funny and talented friend Jen Miller joins me with all kinds of questions, and you'll learn what happened the first time I brought homemade cheesecake to a food day at work, and why I like living in the Midwest, so I hope you stick around. My intention with this show is to simply share the everyday stories and recipes of our sweet Midwest life, mine and yours. I'm just an everyday person who likes to bake. I have to cook. I visit the library often, I try to garden, and I'm in a never-ending search for the best blueberry donut. And I'll find a way to repurpose that rusty 16-gallon oil drum every single season. I'm a home baker just like you. I'm self-taught with the help of my grandma, influence of my sisters, family, and friends, and community cookbooks. There's no edible art here, just down-home Midwest comfort food. I'm also a writer. I've been writing on my blog, randomsweets.com, since 2010. And since then, I've grown my website by adding stories about other topics like places for the best donuts, how to make country grandma's ham gravy, using a vintage milk crate as a wine rack, how to smoke cheese on a grill or a smoker, and where to find the best flat, greasy squares of pizza in the Midwest, which in my opinion are at Pizza King or George's Pizza in Brookings, South Dakota, and Nick's Pizza Palace in Owatonna, Minnesota. But I'm always on the hunt to add new ones to that list. My blog led me to freelance writing for magazines and websites, including a project for thefoodnetwork.com. And in 2018, I was invited to do TV segments on food-related topics, and I've been doing that pretty regularly ever since. Most food-related podcasts focus their attention on guests who are highly degreed and trained, celebrity chefs, cookbook authors, award-winning restaurant chefs and bakers, which is fantastic because we do learn from them. And I'm sure there'll be episodes that we reach out to experts on specific topics that we do here. But I relate more to home bakers and cooks from the Midwest who make salad with Snickers candy bars and apples, and they'll defend their family's tater tot hot dish recipe and grow vegetable gardens. And I want to share their abundance of knowledge, your abundance of knowledge with everyone, with all of us. Plus, who knows better where to get the best beef chislic, Indian tacos, hot beef commercials, strawberry rhubarb pie, and buffalo burgers than the locals. Of course, I had second thoughts or doubts and, wondered if the name was dumb or the show idea wouldn't appeal to anyone. But earlier this year, when I was going through airport security in Salt Lake City, the attendant noticed the Midwest-themed stickers on my laptop. And she stopped me and said, "Now, next time you come through here, I want lefse." I said, "You know lefse?" And she said she was from a little town in North Dakota, and I told her I was from South Dakota and Minnesota. So then she said she'd also like kroomkaka. So I let that conversation validate my idea that there are people from all over who embrace the warm and cozy spirit we have here in the Midwest. So some episodes I'll do solo, and many of them will have guests. I'll start with family and friends and grow as their recommendations lead us to talking with more people. My initial plan is to release a new episode every 2 weeks, hopefully on Thursday nights, just in time for the weekend. As I become quicker at the backstage work that it takes to produce a podcast, I'll increase the number of episodes, and I may add video to some episodes. You can also stay connected with me on social media and visit randomsweets.com often. So one quick housekeeping note before we move forward about the next segment. I made a mistake recording my audio in the next segment. My voice is quieter than Jen's. She followed the rules, so her audio sounds good. So the volume kind of goes up and down. But to preserve the authenticity of that being our first run through, and quite honestly just an effort in progress over perfection, I'm publishing this one as is. I've already got the issue fixed for the next episode. So let's move on and welcome Jen Miller to the show, where she's going to ask me questions that my friends sent in for this episode. Now, Jen was raised in western South Dakota, and then she started her family in eastern South Dakota, and now she lives in the St. Louis area with her husband Nathan and their 5 super smart children. She homeschools. She's a registered yoga teacher, an extremely talented artist and graphic designer. She spent nearly 25 years in a corporate career as a graphic designer and a communications professional. She's designed and illustrated a couple of books, and she very humbly devotes her time and talent to community organizations. So let's meet Jen. Jen, you're here. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I am so happy to be here and be part of this. I'm very honored because, we've been talking about stuff like this forever, many, many years.
I was trying to think the other day if we've known each other since 2008 or was it 2007?
It was 2007. Actually, I was just thinking about this earlier, and it was in the fall after I'd had my oldest. So it would have been 15 years, probably like maybe October.
Okay, sure. But the reason why I get to have you on with me first is kind of a fun story, but Jason and I were going to St. Louis to a Kid Rock concert, and you happen to live in that area, and so I was going to have coffee with you, and I told you that I had asked on social media and things with my friends that I was working on my introduction of my podcast and what do people want to know. And so I had a handful of people that gave me questions that they wanted to know about me. And I told you that, and you're like, oh, what would be really cool is if you had somebody else ask you those questions on the podcast. I loved the idea. So I was thinking, oh, I could have one of my kids do it, or I could have my husband do it. Like, well, I don't want to play favorites either. So who do I ask? And then I thought, well, Jen.
Little did I know I was doing an interview.
Jen, this was your idea. So this is what we're going to do.
Yes. And I'm very excited.
All right. So why don't you just go ahead with some questions and we'll see if I can answer them about myself.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's start with maybe the most obvious. So you talked about a podcast. So why a podcast? Why do you want to start one? And what did you think that you wanted to share and have to say?
That was a lot of questions. Well, the podcast comes back to when I was trying to find a podcast that I wanted to listen to. It was probably in 2018, and I started taking walks outside. And before I would go, I would just sit and spend too much time on my phone trying to find a podcast that I wanted to listen to before I would even leave.
Right.
What I really wanted to find was something where really I felt like I was just sitting down with somebody's grandma or the neighbor or my sisters talking about different recipes or foods that we've had, maybe a new product that we've just tried from the grocery store, or a recipe, a family handed down recipe. And anyway, but listen to other people's conversations about that and the stories that they have to tell and the food memories, and mostly Midwest, because that's where I'm from. I grew up in South Dakota. I live in Minnesota now. I've probably spent more years in Minnesota, more years of my life in Minnesota than South Dakota, but definitely split the time between two. So I kind of feel the Midwest is really sort of, you and I had this conversation. What is the Midwest? Because people perceive it to be different than what we do. And I think in my mind,
depending on the area of the country that you live in, sure.
Right. Because you're in Missouri now, but you grew up in western South Dakota and then spent many years in eastern South Dakota. That's when I met you. And so you're a very Midwestern person. Now you're in Missouri, and you said that people consider that Midwest.
Right.
I don't know if I necessarily do, just because I've only spent 3 days there of my whole life. So I don't really know what it's like. But North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Minnesota, kind of this upper plains more area, but just because we kind of have the same food vocabulary in a way. But anyway, I couldn't find a podcast that seemed like it fit what I was looking for. And I've always loved talking to people. Even when I was growing up, I would get deficiency slips in the mail from my teachers. The grades were always good, but it would have the little part circled on the bottom that would say too much social talking.
I have that in one of my report cards too.
So I'm really not an extrovert, but I like talking to people about food, and it really never mattered. Even when I was in a corporate setting, it really never mattered who somebody was, where they were from. One thing you could talk to people about, no matter what country they were from, is food, because pretty much everybody eats.
Right.
And so I like talking to people and learning about their different ways of making things or doing things. And a lot of recipes that I have that I really like, I think back to, where did this come from? Like my broccoli cauliflower ranch salad or Snickers bars. Some of those I look back and they've always come from somebody. There's a story that goes along with, oh, I remember when I worked at this place and they brought them in and then I had them and I asked for the recipe. And so that's really where the idea came from, was to kind of marry those, the interest of what other people have for food stories, whether it's they're making, baking or cooking at home, or a fantastic restaurant that they've tried, or a bakery that only locals know about, and sharing that with everyone else, because that's how we all know about these things a lot of times, is hearing from our friends. So that's really why I
Sure. And
started it.
the community that surrounds it and comes with it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Very
Mm-hmm.
cool. And then the name. How did you come up with the name?
Well, I've always been sort of that shock and awe person. I always want something to be a little bit different.
It did work.
And
I told my kid, my older two, I said, "Oh, I'm going to help my friend with this podcast." And they said, "What's the name?" And I said, "Funeral Potatoes and Wool Mittens." And they were like, "Oh, that's really cool." So it grabbed a teenager's interest. So you have that.
good. Well, I did have to run it by my children, because they're sort of they're in their early 20s, so they're kind of the voice of not old people like me, and they thought it was okay. But really the name comes from, like I said, I wanted it to catch people's attention and be interesting. My sister Heidi was worried that we were going to talk about funerals and cold weather, and she doesn't like wool because it's itchy, so she was a little bit concerned about the name. We're not talking about funerals. I just like funeral potatoes. To me, it's really the quintessential comfort food. If you don't know what it is, you probably know what hash brown casserole is. You probably know what cheesy hash browns, or there's many names for it, but that's really what funeral potatoes are. If you're in Utah, everybody calls it funeral potatoes. And I don't consider that the Midwest, but it's a comfort food. We bring it, we share with people at funeral luncheons quite often, because it feeds a crowd. People like it. It's really easy to make. It doesn't take a lot of ingredients. By no means is it healthy. I've never looked at the calories or anything, but it's
Right.
really comfort food that we share with other people. So it just kind of had that name. And then I didn't want to just call it funeral potatoes, so I tried to think of something else. And to me, the Midwest, if you're from around here, it's cold. A lot of people wear wool mittens. I wear wool mittens that are the soft, like the flannel or fleece on the inside, so they're not itchy. But to me, they're really warm and cozy, and they're cute, and they have these little Scandinavian designs on them many times. And I'm Scandinavian, like a lot of people around here. And I just put the names together, and I
To
did
create something like welcoming and inviting, and so that you kind of create the cozy atmosphere.
Right, right. I had a few people who said, oh, just name it Random Sweets, because my blog has for so many years been randomsweets.com, and that's really the brand that I've built up. And I get that. But to me, it needed to have its own name. So it really is Funeral Potatoes and Wool Mittens by Random Sweets.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense too. Gives it a little differentiation from food only, since this is also kind of the community and the stories.
Yeah.
I love it. It's so exciting. Okay, so you mentioned you had to run the name by your children. So that's a nice segue to tell us about yourself a little bit and your family.
Sure. Well, I don't have a huge family, but I am so lucky to have all of my immediate family. They live within an hour's drive.
max. And so I'm really lucky because I have my husband, Jason, who of course lives within an hour max. We live together, so. But I have a daughter, Kalani, and my son, Sajan. And I have a sister, my little sister, Callie, and an older sister, Heidi. And then my dad and my mom, my dad is married to my stepmom, Margaret. And then my mom, she lives in Sioux Falls in South Dakota. So everybody's really close. And then Jason's family has very Minnesota ties because that's where they spent most of their time growing up, was in Minnesota. And his mom, Marie, still lives in Minnesota. His sister, Lindsay, lives in Minnesota. His sister, Betsy, lives out in North Dakota. And then his brother, Ryan, and his family, they live in Utah. So they're the only ones that aren't a day's drive away. But we're really lucky to have a lot of family and things nearby.
So obviously, if you have a lot of family and you see each other often, I can only imagine that there is food often incorporated into every time you gather. Would that be a safe assumption?
Oh gosh, every time. And usually more than what we would ever need. Always leftovers on both sides of the family. Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything that you remember as the first thing that you cooked, or any family members that you have any pivotal recollections of, hey, I remember this from like a grandmother, or something that you did with your sisters that stands out to you?
Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, I don't really remember cooking anything, but and baking sort of. I have this one cake recipe. It's kind of funny because it's a plum cake. You use plum baby food, and most people haven't heard of it. And
I didn't even know that plum baby food was a thing until just now.
well, it's not anymore.
Oh,
I
okay.
had a really hard time finding plum baby food, but back in the day, in the 70s, 80s, you could find plum baby food in a jar. And I think it's like 8 ounces that you use in this cake. I usually make it as a bundt cake. There's cinnamon and cloves in there, so it's kind of a warm, spicy cake. And it's not that you can really taste the plums necessarily. It just kind of gives it the moistness. But when I met my friend Tracy, so Tracy, when I met my friend Tracy, somehow we connected again over food and the fact that we both knew what this plum cake was. And she's from Tennessee, so she's not from the Midwest. So I have no idea where this cake recipe came from, where my mom got it. But that's the first thing that I can really remember baking at home when I was a teenager or younger. And then I would usually help my mom make the Ritz crackers that you take and spread peanut butter and then you dip them in melted almond bark at Christmas time. I would usually help her with that.
So when you did this, do you think do you recall it sort of instigating a love of baking to you, or did that happen and evolve over time, that like maybe as you got older, or maybe when you had kids of your own?
Yeah, I don't really know. I only lived at home till I was like 15 and then was off doing other things. And I didn't really start baking until I had kids, probably. And then I would try to make their birthday cakes, and they usually wanted them from Hy-Vee anyway. But because I'm not a decorator. No edible art or anything like that. But
you're not rolling out the fondant and participating in the shows.
Mm-mm.
Gotcha.
No, nothing pretty here. And so I don't really know. I mean, I always loved baked goods. I always loved comfort food, but I didn't start probably cooking or baking until in my 20s. And then I had kids when I was in my later 20s. And so probably started cooking and doing a lot more baking at that point. But I always worked in food service. When I was 14, I started working at a cafe in Brookings, South Dakota as a dishwasher. And then when I was old enough, I started waitressing there. And I have some really good food memories from there because they made the best caramel rolls, butterscotch pie. Do you know what hot beef commercials are?
No, I do not.
So they had the best hot beef commercials. And that's when you take 2 pieces of bread, you put like a shredded roast beef on it, make a sandwich, cut it in half, separate the two on the plate. So there's a spot in the middle. You put mashed potatoes and gravy in the middle, and you put gravy over the top of that bread and sandwich. That's a hot beef commercial.
Oh, okay.
A very Midwest thing, I think. And
it
they
sounds fulfilling and delicious.
Right. Again, I'm not counting the calories. And then there was a pasta salad that they would have, like a Friday night fish fry. And we would set up a salad bar, and there was some kind of a pasta salad on there that I really liked. I mean, I have food memories that go back and things that I know that I liked and wish I could recreate some of those same things, but didn't do a lot of baking when I was a kid.
So
No.
when do you think that that part was for you where you baked? I can identify with this as a mom of many, where you're making the birthday cakes and then you want to be like, I can do it myself. I can do it better than the store. Like you said, we're not going to use the grocery store. But when did that transpire into more like a hobby for you? Because once I knew you, this is something that you would already love to do, and I knew you as
Oh.
cheesecakes, and so that for me, I would not be whipping out cheesecakes. So when did that become something that you thought that you would like to do more than just, it's my daughter's birthday? Or was it because your stuff was so delicious that people said, hey, I had that, could you make one for me? Or
The cheesecake, I've always liked cheesecake. And again, it goes back to when I was a kid. We would eat at Hy-Vee once in a while at when you can go in and order mashed potatoes or chicken or whatever. And I would always get the cheesecake. Well, it wasn't until I was older, 20s, 30s, that I realized that cheesecake that I thought was cheesecake was really a no bake cheesecake. I always loved cheesecake after that and would order it at restaurants. That's the first thing I would look for on a menu was, do they have cheesecake? I don't think I started making them until I had my kids. So I was in my later 20s, and for some reason I made a couple of cheesecakes for one of the kids' birthdays. It must have been Sajan's, because I remember going to my sister Callie's for the party, and Sajan and my nephew Nick have birthdays within a few days of each other. They turned out really good. I remember buying liquor. One of them was a butterscotch, so I remember going to the liquor store and buying some liquor, and they were good. So then I made a couple more to bring to work, and I was so embarrassed because one of them, for sure, I don't remember if they both were, but one was raw in the middle. It was runny.
oh no.
And I think I just thought to myself, oh my gosh, okay, I have to redeem myself and figure this out, learn how to make these better, bring them in again, because I don't want people to be like, oh, she was the person who brought in runny cheesecake. So I sort of perfected it and learned how to make cheesecakes really well, all kinds of cheesecakes. And my family liked them as well. I think my Andes Mint and the white chocolate raspberry truffle are the two most popular and favorite within my family and customers since then that I have baked for. I was putting myself through college at the time and did some freelance marketing projects, worked with the owners of Maderi Acres Greenhouse in Brookings. And when they would start planting their seeds in the greenhouse in the middle of winter in South Dakota, like January, February, I would go in and bring cheesecake to everybody working. And the cheesecakes were pretty good. Then one of their daughters, when they graduated from high school, wanted cheesecake for their graduation party. They wanted nothing but cheesecakes and coffee. So I baked 17 different flavors. I think it was 21 or 22 cheesecakes, and catered that graduation party. And everybody loved them. And I had the best feeling when I left there, how people enjoyed them. And it just took off from there. And people started asking me to make them. And I did.
Yeah, that's very validating too, that you came full circle from the runny cheesecake in the middle to 17 different flavors. Would
Right.
you agree it's safe to say that that's the dish that you're most well known for, would be cheesecakes?
That is the niche that I'm most well known for, and have done, weddings and different fundraising galas, that type of thing, and just private parties in general. I like eating them, but my favorite thing, actually, if somebody were to say, what would you bake at home? I love bars.
And
So,
so just any kind of dessert bar?
hmm which again, I think might be, I've sort of learned that it might be sort of a Midwest thing, that if you go to some other places, bars aren't necessarily the thing. But around here, that if you go to a funeral and somebody's asked people to bring things, or if you go to a church potluck or a family reunion, anything where people are bringing food here, a lot of times you'll
A
see
large gathering, right?
bars. Yep.
So is that the one that you would say a recipe that you could make with your eyes closed? Any of those two, cheesecakes or bars of any sort?
Yes, Yes. A recipe that I could make with my eyes closed would be what I got given to me as a recipe called Yes, Yes bars. A lady that I worked with at 3M one summer brought in, it was my first experience of a food day at work as sort of just a summer intern. And she brought in these caramel brownies and I asked for the recipe. That might have been the first time I ever really asked somebody for something like that. And I could make those with my eyes closed.
That's great. So
Mhm.
speaking of different recipes, and you mentioned that you had done a lot of different cheesecake flavors. How do you come up with new recipes and where do you find your inspiration?
Well, my inspiration really just comes all the time. And it doesn't matter what I'm doing or where I am. And I have a couple of different notebooks or journals that I handwrite different ideas in. I have an app in my phone where I'll just get an idea, which a lot of them get put in there because I might not have my notebooks with me, but I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ideas of different kinds of things to try, not just baking, but cooking,
Right.
casseroles, hot dishes, all just different kinds of things or flavors to mix together. I might see a commercial on TV and it might trigger something, or see something in a grocery store and think, oh, I wonder if these two flavors would go together, or think of something I've already made and then learn of a new ingredient and wonder how that would work to sub out something and try something else. But I write hundreds of things down and don't very often, or certainly not often enough, do I try to make those different things. So I kind of have a goal for myself to try to do that a lot more and come up with some new actual recipes instead of just the ideas.
Do you ever substitute on the fly? Have you ever been in the middle of making something and then just had a moment where you think, oh, maybe I should try XYZ?
Yes, I actually have, and I did that recently, and it turned out that I made some bars that are incredible. And I sort of at the last minute was like, oh, hey, when I make this one thing, I melt this with whipping cream. And anyway, it ended up being where I was making a bar and I melt butterscotch chips. I love butterscotch. And I don't think there's ever enough recipes that have butterscotch in them. But whipping cream, making sort of a ganache, and then mixing that into the bars, it just gave it such an incredible, like deep, rich butterscotch flavor. So I'll make those again, and I need to put them on my blog to share that recipe with people.
So this makes me wonder for people that have any sort of apprehension about baking or any kind of cooking. A lot of times, especially women or moms, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. You have your you're going to present it, you're very excited for people to try it, and then
Mhm.
have you had times where it's just been other than the initial cheesecake that was running in the middle, that you've just had like a disaster, and then how have you gotten past that to go through and try again or keep doing more, and how many times does it take to get it right?
Mm. Yeah, it's just food. So, I mean, I don't know, unless you burn a turkey or something for your big Thanksgiving meal, it's just food. And I have definitely made things that even I don't like enough. Like right now, I have some cookie dough balls sitting in my refrigerator that I'm debating on whether I just throw them away or not, or should I bake them off, because I baked 6 of them and they're really not that great. So
Right.
I don't really want to waste my calories on it. So I I don't even know if I'll bake the rest of them.
I oftentimes
And
feel like I have to give a disclaimer that this is something new. So if it's not
Mhm.
great, that's okay. You
Right,
just try it at least, and then you don't have to eat anymore.
right. And at least try it once. But I mean, if I might try something and go, okay, I didn't quite get it right, but there's potential here and I'm going to try it again. So it just depends. Like this cookie recipe is just like a regular kind of chocolate chip peanut butter cookie. It's nothing great. I'm not going to try it again because I'm going to move on to something else. But there are definitely things that might not work out the first time, but I like the flavor or where it's heading and I'll definitely try it again. I give up after a few times, unless, if I were writing my cookbook, I would be doing a lot more, like get it to where it's perfect. And that could
Sure.
mean 10, 15, 20 times of making something. But right now, that's not the case.
Well, that
If
makes
I make
sense.
something and my family doesn't like it, it doesn't have feelings, and chances are I might not like it either.
That's funny. You save it for leftovers if somebody's really hungry, then they can eat it.
Right.
I find probably with dessert, it's probably a lot easier to have people finish it. Usually, typically things with sugar, people can see past. It's more of the like the main dishes that are
Yeah.
a harder sell.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And I've always been sort of a picky eater, and I'm not fancy. I might go to a steakhouse and I'll order a burger and a beer. But I would try as my kids were growing up. That was kind of the rule. If I made something they thought they wouldn't like, they had to try it once. And if they didn't like it, that was okay because I'm the same way.
Right.
You can't force somebody to like something, and that's okay. Everybody has different tastes.
So, for any novices in the kitchen that may be listening or people that are intimidated, what is one kitchen tool or appliance that you appreciate the most or would say that it's something that you could not live without that makes your experience cooking or baking much easier? Obviously, an oven is off limits, like, the main appliances are assumed, but do you have anything that you can think of that you use the most? That, like, for me, I would think I love my KitchenAid mixer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's one thing that I don't know if I could live without.
Good. So that one's not off limits because that's my answer.
Okay. Okay.
Because
Same.
I do have a commercial KitchenAid stand mixer that Jason gave to me many years ago, and I really think that's when I felt more like a professional baker once he bought me that. And it's old, like it could be 15 years old. I don't know. I couldn't live without that because I have some doughs that it would be really hard to do by hand, or even a handheld mixer, electric mixer just wouldn't be up to snuff. It wouldn't be able to beat the doughs. Also, when I'm making cheesecake, it's very delicate and it just takes some time, like to slowly bring it together. If I had to stand there with a handheld mixer, I would be too impatient. I couldn't just walk away and get the next ingredient prepared while it's just kind of slowly bringing the eggs in, that kind of thing. So I would hands down say a stand mixer. But that's interesting because my daughter Kalani is in a new apartment. She's in college and she doesn't have a mixer, and I've been trying to figure out what kind of stand mixer to get her, different price points. And I want to find one made in America, which is really hard to find a US made stand mixer. So if anybody out there knows of a good one or wants to start
Recommend
a
it.
business, I highly suggest that. But for it fully to be made in the USA. Anyway, the other
Yeah.
thing is a electric hand mixer, and she was making cupcakes the other night and FaceTimed me. It was her birthday, and she was getting end of semester here ready and was bringing them to her class. So she was making cupcakes, and she was just stirring it by hand because she doesn't have even a hand mixer. So we decided that it'd be good for her to have electric hand mixer, at least until a couple years down the road when she's settled into a house and that kind of thing, that what she'll be doing for the next few years, a hand electric mixer will be just fine. And so I think it really depends on what you're doing and making. My sister Callie texted the other day and she's like, I got my big stand mixer out for the first time in a couple years. Like, what are you making? And she said gluten-free pumpkin bars. So it's
I
just nice
guess
to
I
have.
didn't really consider that. You're right. It really depends on what you would use it for. So I use mine multiple times a week. But for other people, yeah, like your sister, maybe not as much. Maybe
But
they're
do you
more
have
of
a
like
hand
a
mixer also?
casserole dish, which that I rarely use.
Do you have a hand mixer though too? Because I have an electric hand mixer
I
and I
do, but I
actually can't live
never use
without
it.
that either.
I never use it. Only
See, I have to
rarely.
have one
Yeah.
because if you're doing like a meringue, or I have my mom's snow frosting, or it's like a 7 minute, the white fluffy frosting, you have to beat that while it's on the stove top in a double boiler. So it has to be in the pot. It
That
can't
already
be
sounds
in the
like a lot
stand
of
mixer.
steps.
It's not. It's really not. It's really not that bad. It's just the mechanics of it. You can't have it in a mixing bowl on a mixer, so you have to have a handheld. So I really couldn't live without either one of them.
So really, if we're getting to the crux of this, there's probably a long list of items that you would need for this type of thing, depending on desserts. I know that you had told me years ago about the springform pans, and I don't know if
Mhm.
I had ever really used them because
Oh.
I wasn't a huge dessert person,
Mhm.
and I did get them, and then we use them now for like my kids to make ice cream cakes, and I thought, oh my gosh,
Oh,
no
yes.
wonder she uses these things.
Yep. People, yeah, I mean, I've seen people use those like a 9-inch round springform pan to make like a pasta dish, where they want it to come out as kind of one nice, pretty thing. So certainly cheesecake isn't the only thing that you can use those springform pans. And those ice cream cakes or layered ice cream cakes are the best. Or if you're doing that and want brownie on the bottom, bake it in the springform, and then you can layer in your ice creams and such. But yeah, you and I differ on our food, the kinds of foods that we eat and our tastes. So
You could have a whole nother
I'm glad
podcast
I'm glad you
episode
still like me.
just
Love
on
it.
using how to use equipment differently. Like I don't even know if I would have ever considered pasta in one of those pans. So maybe you should think about that in the future, and then I'll listen to it so I can use some of my kitchen tools in a different way.
Okay.
So it's a holiday time of year. Do
Yeah.
you have any specific holiday dishes that you enjoy, or maybe that bring back memories that you continue to make or experience in your adulthood?
For holidays, when I think back, well, again, I always loved comfort food. And so Easter, if it was ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, Christmas time, my grandma, Janet, who is not with us anymore, but she would make rosettes and lefse and kroomkaka, which Jen, you and I were talking earlier, and you don't know what kroomkaka is, but you're from the Midwest. I just said it's a very Norwegian thing. It's hard to explain, but it's like the sweet cookie that you is super flat that you make on an iron, and as soon as you take it off of the iron, there's this little wooden roller that you just roll it into kind of a cone. Staka.
Define what you mean by cone. Like an ice cream cone? What do you mean by
Well,
cone?
it would be the shape of, what a sugar cone looks like, right?
Yes.
Wider at the top, pointed at the bottom.
Right.
So if you imagine like a small flour tortilla, and if you rolled it, uh, so one point, would be skinny
Hmm.
and the top would be bigger. Um, Something that you could almost fill, and some people do. I've heard of people filling it with certain, creams or frostings or something like that, which we never did. Ours were just a plain. So as soon as you bite into it, it's very thin. So as soon as you bite into it, it pretty much always crumbles. And my grandpa Elroy, he would dip the pieces into his coffee.
Okay, I just looked them up. I see what you're talking about now. Did you have an imprint to have a design on it too?
Well, I've never made them, but Grandma Janet did. Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Oh, how cool for Grandma Janet. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know. And then rosettes. Oh, and sandbockles too. These are all things that she would make and bring at Christmas time. And her white cookies, it's like a super flat, not too sweet. I don't even like to call it a sugar cookie because it's not. That's it's a different experience altogether. I can't explain it. But Grandma's white sugar cookies and her molasses cookies and her date cookies, all these things that she would bring to the holidays that we didn't get all the rest of the year. Now, she would make her white cookies and her molasses cookies other times of the year, but some of those other labor intensive, like rosettes and sandbockles and lefse and things, would be at Christmas time. And then my mom, and I'll have to do an episode with my mom too and ask her, what were you thinking? Because at Christmas time, she would bake, I swear it must be 20 different kinds of things, maybe more than that, and put them in containers. I mean, there would be stacks of goodies that she would make at Christmas time. And people would bring home leftovers. And
So were these stacks just for your family to enjoy, or were they gifts that she would bring to people?
I don't know if she ever brought them as gifts to people, but when we would have her side of the family over for Christmas or would go somewhere for her side of the family's Christmas, she would bring all these treats. And then everybody would know, when it would come to lunchtime after the dinner and things, we'd enjoy different treats from everybody. And then the thing just kind of became for us to all get like our own Tupperware container or a little plastic container. And we'd go around sort of a smorgasbord and just load up our containers, and we'd come home from Christmas with
All
all these
kinds of
different
goodies and
goodies,
treats.
like an exchange in a way.
Right.
And they would
That's
last,
fun.
you could stick some in the freezer. But she's scaled that back down a lot. And now she just texts us every year and says, what do you want me to make? And then she gets a little list of things from us that we would want her to bring. And then she only brings, that small list now.
So do you have any of these things that you recall that you've tried to replicate yourself?
Yes. So what I always tell her when she says, what do you want me to make? And I'll say, Forgotten Kisses. They're the meringue cookies that have the little tiny chocolate chips and tiny pecan pieces. And they're super easy to just whip up egg whites and then these few ingredients. And the oven is at a low temperature, maybe 250. I can't remember for sure. And you put them in there and you turn the oven off. Basically, just leave them in there overnight. That's why they're called Forgotten Kisses. Hers are so good that's one of the things I have on my list that I want her to make.
Oh, that's fun. It's fun to have those memories or from people to think about that. I think a lot of times you don't associate certain memories that you may have that are with food until later. That you might know that you enjoyed something. And you're like, oh, this always reminds me now that I always think of Thanksgiving because we always had whatever the dish may be. Like for us, we had green beans and mushrooms, and it's something really simple, but I don't know if a lot of other people do that. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I always associate it with like my mom's side of the family
Sure.
and, like a Thanksgiving meal or Christmas meal. And so now that's something that I do with my family as well, but I didn't really connect the dots to how it made me feel and the nostalgia I had until I became an adult and was like, oh, I remember back when your aunts and uncles so it's fun the way you can incorporate those as you're older and with your kids and then the memories that you can share from that.
Yeah. We tease my mom because the Forgotten Kisses, there was one year when she came to Christmas and she didn't have them with her because she forgot them in the oven.
Oh no, that's a story to share for years too, right?
Yes. Every year we're like, did you forget the Forgotten Kisses or did you remember to bring them today? So
Forget the forgotten.
yes.
Okay, well, to pivot just a little bit, going through some of the questions that people had sent in for you, tell your audience about some of the fun road trips that you take and how you incorporate food into those experiences.
Yeah, I think people think that I road trip and have more fun than what I do. That's thanks in part, obviously, to social media, but
Right.
I really am body, but I do like to just randomly road trip, or if I hear about a place and incorporate it into somewhere that we're already going, or kind of make a road trip out of it. But so when we were going to go to St. Louis, we already knew we were going to St. Louis. We were going there for a specific reason, to see Kid Rock. And then, of course, we have to go to the Arch and a few different things. But I'm right away looking, okay, where's the best bakery? I want like an old fashioned bakery, or what do the locals know? And so I asked you and you asked Nathan. And it's like, I just want to try places that aren't a chain, right? Like, unless you live in the area or have been there before. So I just incorporate food into my trips, sort of like how people might incorporate an art gallery or a bike trail or something like that. But I'm trying to find the places that the locals go to, the cafes and things like that.
One of my favorite things that you worked on, which people may not know, is that you got to do this fun little project for the Food Network where you did places to eat in South Dakota. And that was always fun that you kind of, didn't you travel all the way across from one side to the other and then found lots of little places along the way? Places that may have had something interesting like rhubarb or that was really fun.
Yeah, that was one of the coolest projects. If I had to name, cool projects that I've been able to do in my life, that would definitely be one of them. And the project is still on foodnetwork.com, called States Plates. And every state has a little article written about what are some of their dishes that are sort of, what defines in that state. And I knew a few things, but I don't know everything. And so I, again, went out on social media and said, hey, friends and people, like, what do you think of with food when you think of South Dakota? So people gave me a lot of different ideas and then places of where to find those foods. And so I did learn about new places that way and traveled from the east side of the state all the way to the west side and did this really cool project. And I mean, I would do that 100 times if I could.
It was a really fun project. So that's actually a perfect transition to, if money were not an issue for you, what would your ideal job be?
I would be a book author. I love the library and I love bookstores and I love writing and stories. And there's just something that I I would be a book author. Cookbook or probably, I don't know if it'd be nonfiction or fiction. I don't know if I'd have to learn how to make up stories, but definitely a book author or a syndicated radio, host or podcast host. It'd be fun to be syndicated.
That would be fun. It would be fun to have a job where I think, isn't that maybe initially where the podcast idea started, is because we were always talking and then we were like, oh, we're so funny, which we probably were not. And
yes, we are. We're funny.
maybe like, we're hilarious. We should have a podcast. People listen to us. Nobody probably would find half of the stuff that we would talk about funny, but I too think, could I just get paid to comment on my observations? That would be great.
Right.
That's hilarious. Well, okay, so to wrap it up, you're a lifelong Midwesterner at Great Plains. I don't know how we're going to identify this. So
Yeah.
what do you find is the best part of living in that area, and why?
Well, I haven't lived anywhere other than South Dakota and Minnesota. So sometimes I think it's probably hard for me to really say what's better about being here, but I for sure believe in the Midwest nice. Some people don't, but boy, I've definitely experienced Midwest nice being here. And again, not saying that other states and areas that you could live or countries that you live would be, but I love the seasons. Jason and I talk a lot about moving to like Arizona or Alabama. He's lived in both states, and the winters here are, Jen,
They're intense.
They can be intense, they can be brutal, but they also can be incredibly beautiful. And right now I still enjoy all four a solid 4 seasons. They are so different from each other and we get every single one of them here.
Absolutely.
I also we're a very agriculture area, so I like that we support and believe in and we understand agriculture and the importance of farming and our farmers and our growers. And that's, again, maybe something that is a little more defined up here in the Midwest or in the Midwest states, is the agriculture and the farming. If you think about everything you eat every day, where would it come from without some sort of a grower or a farmer? Even prepackaged foods have something in there that somebody grew originally.
Right. It is very true. It is something that I since I've moved away from that area, it is something that I appreciate a lot. Once you're not around it as much, I would say that you are accurate. I do think there are other areas of the country that have a lot of community and people are very friendly, but it is a very specific type of kindness that you get there that cannot necessarily be replicated in other locations.
Sure.
And I do miss it sometimes. You get I think the smiles, driving down the street and you don't know who they are. They're strangers. They wave at you. You wave at them. Everybody says hello. You come out, and it's a pretty beautiful way to live.
Right. And sometimes frustrating. You can be at a 4-way stop and everybody's sitting there waiting for, no, you go. No, you go ahead and go. No, you. It's like, somebody just go.
That is funny. Someone gave that reference one time too, and I didn't really think about it until after we had lived here for a while, which is a larger metro area, a lot more traffic, and then going back, we were like, oh my gosh, everybody drives so freaking slow. And it was like, just go. And so then you're like, oh, but that's how we used to be. And then so it's kind of refreshing and sometimes frustrating at the same time.
Right. Yeah, you got to be aggressive. We go up to the Minneapolis area quite a bit, and you can't drive like that up there. You have to be aggressive. You're never going to get into a lane. You're never going to be able to turn a corner.
Get across the street. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add about yourself or your love of cooking, baking?
No, but I just really want to say thank you to you, Jen, because we've talked about our dreams and what would we do if we could do anything, and just having you as a friend for so many years. And like I said, we have very different food uh, cultures and what we eat and do and prepare. But I can't wait to have you back as a guest and talk
Oh my
about
gosh, I would love it. I'd be honored.
I would love to have you back. There's a lot of things that you could share with people and knowledge that you have that I don't know, certainly, which this is the whole point to this podcast.
Well, I'm
And
so proud of you, and I can't wait to see what manifests for you and all of the success that comes your way from this. So congratulations on all of it.
thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're welcome.
Well, that was a sweet ending to episode 1. I want to give a tremendous thank you to my son Sage and Perry, who has been training me how to audio engineer in Logic Pro in order to create this podcast. Luckily, he's still answering my calls. And to my daughter Kalani, who gives me blunt and honest feedback, and she told me she would listen to my podcast if I make one. And to my husband Jason, who's out working hard every day while still encouraging me to launch this podcast and do the things that fill my soul with happiness. In episodes to come, my sisters and I will talk about my Grandma Janet's baking. And my dad will talk about a nearly 70-year tradition of making homemade ice cream on December 23rd. My mom's delicious recipes for Christmas baking, we'll share those. We'll talk about the recipe that my daughter brought to me from TikTok that's now on our meal rotation. And I want to talk to my son about how he makes my pepperoni spaghetti bake. And of course, we should definitely talk about what funeral potatoes are exactly. I'm so happy that you're here. So please rate and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. Even if you have to binge listen the next time you take a Midwest road trip. And please share this with a few friends who you might think get a kick out of it too. I'm excited to hear your ideas. Sweet wishes!